It's a very, very special honor indeed to welcome tonight Mr. John O'Sullivan.
Jennifer, thank you very much indeed. Well, Jennifer, ladies and gentlemen, I don't think anybody could possibly have deserved that introduction that I got. Grateful though I am, Jennifer, that I got it. I will say that on an occasion when I was giving a speech some years ago, my mother was there, and they'd read out a list of things I'd done and jobs and so on, and she said, "Yes, I know, we're all very worried. John just can't seem to hold down a job." Now, I very much want to just begin by saying what a matter of a privilege it is for me to be here, and particularly to be here in an occasion associated with Tony Blankley. I met Tony through the world of journalism and in Washington politics. He was working at that time, of course, for Newt Gingrich. I was editing National Review. We got to know each other, and we got to know each other much better subsequently when we met with our wives on cruises, and we became very good friends. And as a result of that, you invited me to help at the fellows, and I had the greatest pleasure in doing so. You know, sometimes these things work. You have to plow through a lot of material in order to register a verdict, which is often hard as well. It was hard to choose here, but it was really rewarding to see so many able people, and you have given them a really good chance, and I'm grateful for it. I should say that high though their qualities were, I thought that Tom and Gillian really stood out, and I'm delighted that a colleague of mine from NR should be one of those who've succeeded. I'd also like to say that Gary Hoffmeister drove me here. He picked me up, and we had a terrific conversation about Broadway and music and so on. And I want to congratulate him. I knew he was a star of the Broadway stage, but I didn't realize that he could produce such a terrific rendition of what is actually one of the best national anthems ever written. And let me just say this, that you know, Thomas Beecham was a famous English conductor, a man of very self-confident imperial views, and he once produced an orchestration of the English national anthem, and somebody on hearing it said that he now realized that every other orchestration of God Save the Queen had been done by a Republican. Well, I have to say, having heard Gary sing the national anthem here, every other version I've heard sung has been done by a Liberal Democrat. Now, before I get on to the serious bits, I should just say, that reminds me of a marvelous story about Beecham, which is relevant to politics. He was at a cocktail party in the 1930s, and he found himself, as one often does, you know, next to somebody whom you know, but you can't put a name to the face. And he tried all his normal methods of finding out who he was talking to. None of them worked, none of the gambits worked. And eventually he used one that had never before failed, and he said to her, "What's your husband doing these days?" And she said, "Oh, he's still king." So we conservatives in both countries need to remember the authority that certain principles are attached to. I should add, by the way, that there's absolutely no truth in the rumor that I am a refugee from National Review. In fact, my position is very clear on Trump. I am at the exact midpoint between my colleagues at National Review and my wife. Now, my talk is entitled Restructuring American Strategy, Restoring a World. And the phrase restoring a world may remind you of Henry Kissinger's great first book, A World Restored, about the 1815 Congress of Vienna, and its aftermath, which was almost a century of peace until 1914. But there was another peace established in 1815 too, somewhat less precariously, which also ended in 1914. And that was the liberal world order made possible by the supremacy of British naval power and the growth of the British Empire outside Europe. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to go all parochial on you and preach the virtues of Imperial Britain. But that second peace outside Europe achieved an enormous amount in 100 years, including the abolition of the international slave trade and the massive wealth-creating investments that transformed life in the United States, Latin America, the Empire, of course, and, as Marx himself ruefully admitted, wherever capitalist trade made its way. Lord Palmerston described British imperial policy not as simple imperialism, but as follows. Our policy is trade without the flag where possible, trade with the flag where necessary. And under that slogan, and with the protection of the Royal Navy, a world economy, a liberal world economy, was created and flourished until 1914. The First World War weakened Britain to the point where it was unable to sustain this protecting role. But America, unfortunately, was not yet ready to undertake that role as we left it. Hence, what was described brilliantly this morning by Victor, the debacle of the 1930s, which led to the outbreak of the Second World War. There was simply no hegemonic power to keep order between 1914 and 1941. Well, that changed, obviously, on December the 7th, 1941. Could argue this had already begun to change with the signing of the Atlantic Charter in Placentia Bay by Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, which really signified the transfer of power and the liberal responsibility for upholding a liberal world order from Britain to the United States. And that led in quite quickly afterwards, because of the victory in war, to the establishment of the United Nations, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and a whole series of international institutions, with America taking on the formerly British role of upholding all those things militarily. Now, let me make 2 points here. For 200 years, the combined GDPs of the United States and the UK were usually about 60% of world GDP. Of course, the UK had the lion's share of that in the 1750s onwards, and the US had the lion's share from 1945 to the present. But the key fact is that the two liberal superpowers between them had the resources to uphold world order and ensure that world order was liberal for well over 200 years, is a fact that we don't pay enough attention to. Their joint approach, differing but not by much, over the centuries, has been to support property rights, free trade, free investment, more or less free markets, the rule of law, and the freedom of the seas. It has been an enormous benefit to mankind, and not least, by the way, since 1989, when billions of workers have emerged from Asian stagnation onto the world market, labor market, and onto the possibility of a middle-class life. But all this rested for 200 years or more on the Anglosphere's economic supremacy. Is that now vanishing? Are both our nations being overtaken by newer powers with different values? And if so, will the world be different? Less liberal, less prosperous, more violent? Well, I'm going to come back to those questions. This liberal world, the second point is this. This liberal world order has always had its enemies, which we've had to resist and then defeat. The German Empire, the Nazis, the Soviets, and we'll fill in the blanks for a few more as we go on. To avert those kind of threats, both liberal powers at different times have sought to establish institutions of diplomacy and cooperation, to agree on rules and to settle disputes peacefully. The League of Nations was the first such attempt, and as Victor pointed out, this failed because America opted out and the British then lacked the strength to support it effectively. 1945 was the second attempt, but the Soviets resisted, being half in and half out of the system, ignored it when they wished, broke its rules systematically, took over Eastern Europe, and set up an alternative system. America and its allies, in response to that, promptly established NATO and the other institutions of the Atlantic Alliance in order to resist Soviet expansionism. That Atlantic Alliance, by the way, I'll just say something which is normally not noticed. The European powers were allied with America in NATO, but Britain was the one power that was allied with America outside of NATO, because we still possessed an empire, and we still possessed all the institutions that enabled us to play a part in, for example, preventing the communists winning in Malaya, winning the Borneo crisis, and so on and so forth. Now, the Atlantic Alliance had two great victories: halting the Soviets under Truman, Kennedy, Eisenhower, and other presidents, and rolling them back under Reagan and Bush. The second victory in 1989 and 1991 unambiguously re-established a liberal world order on the Anglo-American model, with free movement of capital and so on, not only in Eastern Europe, but also in the Third World. NATO was now the central security organization in the world. It was almost as if the period 1914 to 1989 had never really happened. You may remember at the time some people said that history had finally come to an end. Now, in retrospect, we can see that that post-Cold War world ended itself in 2008 as a result of two events: Russia's unpunished invasion of Georgia and the 2008 financial crisis triggered by the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers. The first, the unpunished invasion of Georgia, marked the end of NATO expansionism and the West's unquestioned dominance. Georgia had recently been backed by the US for membership of NATO. Germany and France had effectively vetoed it. Soon afterwards, Russia had acted to demonstrate that Georgia, far from joining the West, was still very much in the Russian sphere of influence. The West acquiesced. France and Germany with enthusiasm, the rest of Western Europe with relief, the US with reluctance, and Central and Eastern Europe under real protest. The 2008 financial crisis, the second cause, which was almost willfully misinterpreted as resulting purely from the absence of regulation, I'm sure Mary would agree with that, led to a comprehensive collapse of confidence. Financial institutions, supranational structures, political leaderships, market theories, Western civilization itself, of course, bankers, all fell victim to popular alarmism, skepticism, even hatred. These self-destructive passions were further magnified by the Euro crisis, which proved even more damaging and more intractable than the subprime mortgage one, if less easy to blame on markets. But the US, as the hegemon of the post-Cold War international system, suffered probably the greatest loss in power and reputation, if not in wealth. In America, that that loss translated into a desire to retreat from the arena of failure. Now, this is usually interpreted as isolationism, which I don't believe it is. It is a popular refusal to accept fighting wars we don't really intend to win. Not wars of choice, so much of wars of strategy and wars of balance. And while Americans as a whole are usually prepared to support their president when he starts a war, they will stay to the bitter end only if they feel that the war is just and winnable and being fought to win. They lose faith in military ventures that the government doesn't fight in that spirit. And the general change, this loss of confidence from these two shocks, produced, of course, the election. This is my second point. The post-Cold War world, the re-establishment of liberal order, really began to crumble in 2008. That produced the second big change, the election of Barack Obama. And that went on to the reset button rapprochement with Russia, the winding down of Afghanistan and Iraq interventions, the president's Cairo speech, wooing Islam in order to isolate Islamism, Washington's enthusiasm for the Arab Spring, and much else. This was an America that wanted to lead from behind and sometimes didn't even want to lead at all. The problem is, again, this is very much repeating what Victor says, and of course, I've been undercut by all the speeches today. Practically everything I'm saying I had to rewrite because of what you'd all said. The problem is that this kind of American retreat leaves the world with no one to broker settlements and ultimately to impose them without war. The UN cannot do this. It is designed with its veto powers to be an institution, that arbitrates, an instrument of great power diplomacy rather than a substitute for it. So you might say that in the last 26 years, since '89, the world has gone from a duocracy to a monocracy to a nullocracy. The result is that states and non-state actors with unsatisfied grievances and ambitions, some of them, I'm sorry to say, bad guys, feel free or freer to pursue their ambitions without taking Washington's likely response into account. Hence Iran's pursuit of nuclear ambitions, threatening instability, Russia and China's flouting of Washington's request for the extradition of Snowden, Venezuela's support for narco-terrorists, the Syrian civil war, which has drawn in combatants from afar as Iran to the Gulf, and the unpunished murder of an American ambassador in a country, Libya, that the US had helped to liberate. I should add, in view of the latest news, of course, the unpunished murder by the Russian Secret Service of a defector in the city of London, which is only now producing the kind of response that should have come before. Now, when you look at those kind of problems, you realize that a humble foreign policy is baffled by them because it has no clear interest or fast friends. In Egypt, our policy has gone from wooing Islam in vague terms that encourage Islamists to edging out our autocratic ally Mubarak without giving him an escape hatch, something of which we should be deeply ashamed, to naively embracing the Arab Spring, to overinvesting in President Morsi as he betrayed the Arab Spring, to dithering in the face of the coup, to the present policy of throwing up our hands in horror and not knowing quite what to do about the Egyptian regime. But even if the US had a clearer idea of what to do in such cases, its reputation and thus its power to intervene are diminished. Gaddafi, before he fell, had surrendered his nuclear option following the conquest of Baghdad. Iran offered negotiations at the same time, but Washington's power to help is no longer so strong because it doesn't have as its accompaniment the power to harm. And as both Egypt and Pakistan illustrate, even withdrawing its military aid would damage its own interests. There are other examples which I won't go into. All in all, the US under Obama has embraced a grand strategy that is only half of the traditional Anglo-American one of property rights, rule of law, free trade underpinned by American power. It's not, first of all, he's only half interested. He's not interested in the rule of law, obviously. And I would say property rights don't figure largely in his imagination either. But the main thing is he wants the retreat of American power and the settlement of disputes by the local balance of power. But the retreat of America destabilizes balances of power locally all around the world. So the world started to crumble in 2008. The second thing is American policy, by retreating from it, by not solving the problems, has made that crumbling faster and worse. Now the third. The third is the implosion of our European allies in Europe. Let me suggest that Europe's current crisis, and I believe it to be a profound and important crisis, a civilizational one, is composed of three things, or driven by three things. First, the euro has destabilized southern Europe by creating circumstances in which the countries of Spain, Italy, Portugal, and Italy really cannot compete. If Greece were to be on competitive terms with Germany, it would have to increase its productivity by about 35% in a year. No one believes that possible. The consequences of imprisoning them in what is an unrealistic exchange rate in the euro has led to unemployment rates of 14, 15, 16, and in Spain, 25%. But even more than that, look at the transformation of Southern Europe politically. The 4 countries I've mentioned all had conservative governments of a kind 10 years ago. What they now have is either a kind of Trotskyist regime in Greece, or in Italy and Spain, and Portugal, they have regimes in which there is a conservative majority has been replaced by a left majority in their parliaments and by confusion in their form of government. We don't quite know what policies will emerge from such a confused situation. And furthermore, an even more sinister version of this is that if you look at the left in politics of those countries, the old, respectable centre-left social democratic parties, I'm no friend to them, but at least your wealth wasn't safe, but your personal safety was guaranteed. They have been replaced by very left parties indeed, by parties which range from Trotskyists on the one hand to the fun anarchism of Dario Fo, whose play Can't Pay, Won't Pay is in fact the ideological inspiration officially for the Italian, I forget the name of the movement, but the left movement that's arisen there, and is in effect what those parties would like to pursue on the international stage. Now, the euro crisis was the first effect. Secondly, the migration crisis. Now, the origin of the migration crisis in Europe is the agreement to abolish internal European borders without first properly securing the European Union's external borders. Added to that, encouraging people to come without knowing how many or how to accommodate them, the potential pool of immigrants from the Middle East and Africa is several billion people. And thirdly, a weak legal system that really deprives national governments of the right, of the ability to carry out deportation effectively. The result of all of this, as we've seen in Germany, but also, by the way, in France, is a civilizational crisis with very severe security implications. And the inability, as Victor pointed out, of a civilization as great as Europe to respond effectively to this crisis is the most worrying thing of all. And that stems from the third cause of the crisis, and that is profound disagreement on the nature of the EU. The Germans, the French, the Eurocrats in Brussels, they want to build a new kind of political unit based on hostility to the nation state. But peripheral powers like Britain, Denmark, and the Central European countries are devoted to the nation state, which to them represents the national personality. You might want to read a very interesting piece by Adam Garfinkel, the editor of the American Interest, who after a visit to Germany, in which he saw all of the leading figures, came back saying they basically don't think people have a right to a state of their own, a people of their own, because they think any choice to have a society that reflects you is in effect a disguised racism. Now that's not what the people of Europe think, but the fact that the elites think that is going to makes the crisis very, very difficult to resolve. So the EU is changing its character without agreement, and we therefore must ask ourselves, how useful is Europe going to be as an ally of the US in upholding world power and world order? Fourth, the changing character of global institutions. Now, my colleague, old colleague at Hudson, John Fonte, is the real expert on this, but many of you may be aware of his work, in which he points out that the idea of global governance is growing as a justification for global institutions. Once international institutions were there to provide arenas for nation states and great powers to settle disputes without conflict. To some degree, that still happens, but they are now more ambitious. In shorthand, I would make this distinction, a distinction between supranationalism and internationalism. Internationalism makes international bodies the agents of nation states and governments. Supranationalism makes nation states and governments the agents of global institutions. That has a lot of that has very great significance in areas like climate change, law of the sea, human rights, refugee policy, and so on. But the context that is important here is in upholding international order, because the global institutions would like to tie down nation states like the United States in their job of upholding international order. I think it was John Bolton today who mentioned the fact that all the legal restrictions mean that 3/4 of the bombs on American planes come back unused because they can't guarantee, they can't meet the legal restrictions. Israel, in particular, has been a target of lawfare of a completely prejudiced kind. And what does it matter to Russia? Because Russia simply ignores Council of Europe rules and so on. So I would say we are facing an international environment in which the United States, in doing its primary job of upholding international order, with less and less support from Europe to be expected, finds itself operating in a legal environment in which it's very hard for it to act boldly in defense of its own interests or in defense of the general interest. China would be I think it's my fifth point. Well, others have discussed China, and I don't think I can add greatly, except one thing. China and India are growing powers, and they will have a larger and larger share of world GDP. It is therefore very important that we try to encourage India, as opposed to China. I don't want bad relations with either, although I do want to defend myself against them if necessary. But India is part of our civilization more fully than China, because it's an English-speaking country. And we need to remember that the kind of liberal institutions that we take for granted exist also, and genuinely exist in India, even though, of course, they sometimes don't always meet our standards. But when push comes to shove, it will be very important that a power that is going to be as rich and powerful as India should be on our side, and we need to cultivate them. Now, the consequences. Well, we imagine how long have I got? No, seriously, I mean, have I got another 5 minutes or 10 minutes? Okay. Well, we imagine we know everything that Winston Churchill said. I mean, there are so many volumes of his history and reminiscence and so on, and quotations from him fill books. So it's a pleasant surprise for me to come across a quotation of Churchill's that I didn't know anything about. It appears in the winter issue of the American Interest in an article by Professor Eliot Cohen, himself a very distinguished historian. It's taken from a 1935 luncheon party held by a then famous American foreign correspondent, Vincent Sheen, in the south of France. It shows Churchill relaxed but combative, responding across the dinner table to clever people who thought he was attaching too much weight to Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia. Very point about appeasement we discussed earlier. Churchill's demurred. The problem, he said, is not Italy or Ethiopia. It's not the thing we object to, he said. It's the kind of thing. You don't think that's a very good Churchill quote, do you? But wait. When asked by his hostess if the British had not committed that kind of thing many times before, Churchill suggested that Britain had done so in, he said, an unregenerate past. But since the Great War, a large fabric of international law had been established to restrain nations from infringing on each other. That was now at risk. In trying, I quote, "In trying to upset the empire of Ethiopia, Mussolini is making a most dangerous and foolhardy attack upon the whole established structure, and the results of such an attack are quite incalculable. Who is to say what will become of it in a year or 2 or 3? With Germany arming at breakneck speed, England lost in a pacifist dream, France corrupt and torn by dissension, America remote and indifferent. Madam, my dear lady, do you not tremble for your children?" Churchill's prescience, as always, is remarkable. What followed, of course, was the Second World War. Whether or not the children of Churchill's hostess were among the victims, Mussolini was. He ended up hanging upside down in a Milan piazza. Like Churchill, however, Professor Cohen was less concerned with the thing than with that kind of thing. In his case, not so much Putin's de facto invasion of Ukraine as its impact upon the post-Cold War structure of international order. Whatever the rights and wrongs, risks and gains of NATO expansion, the Soviet-era transfer of Crimea to Ukraine and the Maidan Revolution, the rules of international life clearly prohibit subverting, invading, occupying, and ultimately either conquering or dismembering a sovereign state. Such actions are the kind of thing that signal a wider breakdown in civilized international conduct and increased security for all states. Ukraine is a particularly instructive example of the kind of thing because its sovereignty and borders were guaranteed in the Budapest Treaty by Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom in return for its handover of nuclear weapons. In effect, Ukraine decided to entrust its security to international law rather than to military resources. But international law is in the end dependent upon the decisions of sovereign states to observe, support, and even implement it. Even if Russia had legitimate claims to Crimea or some wider sphere of interest, which is highly dubious, it had accepted a duty to settle such claims by peaceful means. As we know, however, Russia used its sovereign power to override such law by invading Ukraine. Now, in the last 2 decades, especially since the US invasion of Iraq, there has supposedly been a kind of semi-philosophical division in the West on attitudes to international order. Americans were said to be Hobbesians from Mars, Europeans Kantians from Venus. The former relied on military force to protect their interests, the latter placed their trust in law and ultimately in non-military sanctions. Now, I think, I'm no philosopher, but I think that contrast was drawn too simply. I don't blame Kant for European foreign policy, and I happen to know the eminent Hobbes scholar, Noel Malcolm, who says that actually Hobbes wasn't particularly tough in foreign policy terms. But that distinction was not entirely false. In the writings of its 2 principal theorists, Robert Kagan for the Hobbesians and Robert Cooper for the Kantians, it was presented clearly and its implications worked out persuasively. My own sympathies are with the Hobbesians, but a common sense reconciliation of the 2 attitudes might be that the Kantians are the first line of defense against aggression, subversion, and other international violations, and the Hobbesians are the fallback team that take over against recalcitrant intruders when the law fails. Neither team is covering itself with glory in the Ukraine crisis. The Hobbesian United States, though committed by its Budapest signature to defend Ukrainian sovereignty, has yet to decide on something as elementary as to whether to provide lethal weaponry. That may be attributable to the fact that the Obama administration is a largely Kantian one, as its policy on everything else, particularly Iran, demonstrates. But if Obama is a Kantian, as seems clear, this reveals a serious problem with the theory. If the Hobbesians can't be relied upon to save the Kantians' bacon, then the latter must show that their non-lethal weaponry is effective against formidable opponents. But the record of the Europeans in the Ukraine crisis is much worse than that of the Americans. I mean, if your argument is that you are going to be a more reliable protector against international violations than the United States because you will use law, then you should resort to law. But in fact, when Russia occupied Georgia, which was the kind of trailer for this, President Sarkozy of France rushed to the Kremlin and on behalf of the European Union agreed on a compromise that left Russian troops occupying large parts of the country. Somehow, Kantian respect for law didn't figure in his calculations. Now, this no more means that Putin can sweep all before him than Hitler could do, because action prompts reaction. Threats invite resistance, at least eventually. And, I think this is a point I think I should make. 22 political leaders from Central and Eastern Europe, channeling Churchill in a way, responded to the Russian occupation of Ukraine with a letter to President Obama seeking America's recommitment to their region in 2009, his first year. That letter was attacked by former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder and ignored by the US administration, then naively entranced with a Russian reset foreign policy. Ukrainians are fighting today for their country, and though they are resisting superior force with inferior weaponry, they show no signs of enduring either surrender or final defeat. So we don't know how Putin's gambit will turn out. But we should never wait too long before responding, not to the thing, but to the kind of thing. So, what do we do? Well, I'm happy to say, Jennifer, by the way, I'm near, I'm happy to say that to the end, but some problems solve themselves. Eventually, unrestrained global and regional disorders, such as we are now seeing, will seriously damage US interests and people. Americans, particularly the Jacksonian tendency, outraged, will join others, like Hamiltonians, in favoring a forward US policy and a serious response. They will elect a strong American president. Second, that president will want allies. At present, indeed, one of the things that as Victor made clear, it's going to take a long time before we have a lot of options. We're going to have to do what Reagan did. We're going to have to start building up our defense forces, encouraging our allies, really bullying them to do the same, and in taking 1,000 other steps diplomatically and in other ways to point out that America is back, and even if at the moment we're not in the position that Reagan left us in, we will be in time, and other nations should take account of what we will do then. Now, a strong American president who does that will want allies. At present, I was just about to say, one of the things that I think is rightly being done by the American administration is to try to build up effectively an Atlantic economic union, potentially the world's largest free trade area with more than half its GDP. That would help to take account of the rise of China in economic terms. And it could be, if ambitiously conceived and carried through, solvagate many other European problems, from Turkey's EU application through saving the euro to establishing federalists and enabling federalists and sovereigntists to pursue their causes in the safe haven of a wider body. But Europe will be an uncertain ally for all the reasons I gave. NATO must be kept. We must get the allies to spend more than a miserable 1% that the Germans and most other Europeans spend on it. And we must demand more support for the strong US policy such a president would do. And if they don't? Well, in that case, without breaking NATO, because it would be foolish to do that, we should nonetheless look for alternatives, not alternatives here, for accompanying relationships. And here is where I mentioned, again, first India, and then Brexit. India, I've already said, is an important country. It's populous. It's got a reformed economy. It will reform further. It will have its ups and downs, but I think it's going to be a very important country in future years, a rich one. And we need to ensure that it is clearly on our side against all the troubles in the world. In the particular case of India, terrorism is a common ground. They are as hostile to terrorism, particularly Islamist terrorism, more hostile than any European country and than most other countries in the world. That is the basis in the short term for building up a strong relationship. And Brexit. The Americans, since the early 50s, the State Department and practically all establishment opinion has wanted Britain inside the European Union. And they wanted that for a simple reason. They felt that if Britain inside would be moderating any anti-American tendencies, either diplomatically or in terms of trade. I see that argument. But what it neglected was that the longer Britain stayed inside the European Union, the more its attitude would come to resemble the other members of the European Union. And that is clearly what has happened in recent years. Now, I'm not against the European Union. I've been very critical of it tonight, but it's got its strong side. However, I don't think it suits the British. It's based upon a different a different system of law, different ideas of administration. Britain is, in a sense, halfway, a mid-Atlantic power, between the libertarian politics of the United States and the administrative, centralized, regulatory politics of the European Union. And the way, if we stay in the Union, we will move more and more in the European direction. If we leave, we will move back towards America and become a more reliable ally, I think, too. By the way, from a diplomatic standpoint, it is clear the official position taken by any leading figure in American life should be to say it's for the British people to decide what they want, and they are our friends, and we will respect whatever decision they make. We are not going to tell them which way to go. But at the moment, it looks as though the State Department and the President are going to carry on with the policy of trying to convince the British they must stay in, even though I would have thought the news reports all made it plain we should leave. Now, I don't think I want to say much more, so I'll say, in retrospect, the post-Cold War world from 1989 to 2008, though it looked very risky when we were living through it, now looks like a success story, with Central and Eastern Europe gradually morphing into market democracies, a peaceful status quo seemingly established with Russia, billions of poor people moving out of poverty and into the middle class throughout Asia, and even some ruinous conflicts in Yugoslavia settled by a mixture of US force and multilateral diplomacy. Most of these achievements rested in part on American power, hard and soft, and the widespread belief in its efficacy. The first is much reduced and the second is completely evaporated. At present, we are now living through a period similar to what Jock Colville, Churchill's private secretary, called the fatal hiatus, the years 1945 to 48 between Yalta and the Truman Declaration, when America demobilized and partied, Western Europe froze, starved, and trembled, and Stalin gradually absorbed Eastern Europe through his salami tactics. That period came to an end when America ceased retreating, returned to Europe economically with the Marshall Plan, established the NATO alliance to enable Europe to recover and develop behind America's military shield. That happened not by accident, but because Truman Democrats, leading Republicans, and realistic Europeans, like Labour's Ernest Bevin, had a certain idea of the West and united to revive it. The same vision is now needed, mainly in Washington, but also in Berlin, Paris, and London, because it won't happen by accident. Thank you. Do you want me to come down? Okay, thanks. Oh, of course, yeah, sure. Just.
You want to have a question? Yeah.
Somewhat of a question, but as much of a comment on the kind of thing.
Yes.
Having worked and traveled a bit in Africa, I noticed that the Anglophone African countries have a middle-class clerical group that the other African countries don't have. And I would suggest that that may be part of your legacy as well, and wonder if there's a way to build on that.
Well, let me say that that's very interesting. Thank you. I didn't know that. And of course, I don't know Africa at all well. I will quote Simon Martin Lipset's remark, the great American social scientist, a Canadian himself originally, who said that if you want a criterion for learning in advance whether or not a particular developing country is a democracy, why don't you find out whether it was once a British colony? And he said there's an enormous overlap between the two things. In some ways, it's not fair to the French, because, but that may be because the French haven't always left their colonies. They've just declared them independent and stayed. That's why whenever there's trouble in some of the northern countries in Africa, the French it's the French who settled the matter right away. That sort of no longer happens with the British. You don't get interventions in other countries to the same degree as you did back in the 50s and 60s. So I think what you said is interesting and true, and I think that institutions like the Commonwealth, which I scorned for many years, have turned out to have a good purpose. The good purpose is that people don't like to be thrown out of it, so they do tend where they can to be better. The Mozambique has actually applied to join it, although it's had no connection with the British before that. On the other hand, we have to say that in recent years, the Commonwealth, which used to have quite serious standards, has let them go because it's allowed Mugabe to stay. And that's because of the influence of South Africa. So I would say that encourage the British to begin to use their pressures within the Commonwealth and other institutions to maintain democratic standards. Not always, you can't be too purist, but you can't allow monsters to rage around unpunished. Yes. Ah.
Oh, right there.
I can't point because I can't see anything to.
Yes, Mr. O'Sullivan.
Yes.
I've often looked at our first generation of NATO partners and thought that if they're unwilling to make a further commitment to their own security, that after the fall of the Warsaw Pact, we should reach forward to the Baltic republics, to Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and reach out and bring them in as a second tier to NATO. Would you comment on that?
The NATO expansion has. I'm sorry. You've often thought that the Western Europeans were such a total loss that we should bring the Central and Eastern Europeans in. Well, that has happened to a considerable extent. Although all kinds of rules and agreements with Russia have meant that we haven't established ourselves in those countries in military terms. They're members of NATO, but we don't have NATO troops in them. So I would say that job has been half done. Now, I think there's another element here which is important. I don't think this matters much while Putin is there. I mean, he is going to be intransigent. But in the long run, what we want to get the Russians to do is to give up their neo-imperial mindset and regard their former possessions as independent nations with formal equality with them. Now, that's going to be a big deal to get them to do that, but other countries have done it. Most West Europeans have done it, so it shouldn't be out of the question. In order for that to happen, we have to make it plain, it seems to me, that we will admit the Russians into the institutions of the Western Alliance, the Euro-Atlantic institutions, when they are prepared to be, so to speak, just another member. Because you don't want to have a wounded animal prowling around on the perimeter, first of all, and secondly, because the extension of NATO membership, far more than the EU membership actually, stabilized and brought about economic reform successfully in Eastern Europe in the period, in the 10, 15 years after 1989. I think the same thing would tend to happen in Russia as well. But in order for that to happen, there has to be a change in the Russian mentality, and we must encourage that change by making it plain that they will become our full and equal partners with us in the Euro-Atlantic institutions when they do it.
Okay, I think we
Yes.
have one more question, then any final thoughts you may have.
Okay, this lady there.
Peter Bob. I have a question regarding to the migrant crisis. Just like the rest of Europe, England also faced a migrant crisis, especially last year when it's disclosed both in Rotherham and Birmingham that mainly Pakistani guys groomed thousands of English girls for over decades without being discovered or without being reported for sexual abuse. So is leaving EU gonna make England better for migrant assimilation?
Well, it will actually enable. There are two sorts of immigration into Britain. There is the immigration from the EU and immigration from non-EU countries. The immigration from non-EU countries, the British government can control and does. in my view, not sensibly or effectively, but it does have the power. And you can't just come in if you're from India or Africa. You can't just come into Britain. And if you're a member of if you're living in an EU country, you can. Let's say the British are not. You have an absolute right to residence and citizenship in England. So getting control of immigration as a global total can't be done while the British remain in the EU, and everybody knows that, and that's why the British government is producing all these fancy ideas which actually don't directly control immigration, but which they say will discourage it. No one really believes it, but that's the reason. Now, you're quite right. There was a very, very serious and horrifying series of events in which people in about 30 cities, you had they're described always in the newspapers as Asians, but everybody knows that they were in fact Muslims, and they were generally from Pakistan, one or two other places, but mainly Pakistan. The Sikhs and the Hindus are extremely irritated at the term Asians, which they feel spreads the blame to them. This resulted, it seems to me, from something that is not only it results from two kinds of cultural problem. A Muslim cultural problem and a Western, particularly English cultural problem. The Muslim cultural problem is that Islam, not necessarily to do with doctrine, but it encourages two superiorities. It encourages Muslims to feel superior to all other people, and it encourages male Muslims to feel superior to women, whether they're Muslim or not. And that produced in the English cities you're talking about, feelings of contempt towards the young English girls. They were almost all English. They were generally described as Christian, though that is a social and not a religious description. And so they were horribly treated. I mean, they were raped. They were groomed to be prostitutes. They were physically badly beaten. When they or their parents went to the police, they were not given any help. In some cases, the police returned them to their assailants. Why did that happen? I mean, in the England in which I grew up, this is completely absurd. I mean, you can't imagine it having happened. Now, the answer is that there is a complete loss of confidence, self-confidence and morale in English society and in British society more widely, less so in Scotland. There is a cultural masochism, and there is a sense that we have no right to judge others, it's their culture, we mustn't be seen as racist. And I have to say the Muslim leaderships, in the civic leaderships, played this card quite well, so that they, in a sense, said to the police, let us handle this, and they didn't handle it very well, and the police let them do so. So we have to do two things. We have to recover our own moral self-confidence and assert that we are a decent people and we have a right to the kind of society which we've created, which is a better society than most of those on this earth. It's the same right, there's the same self-confidence that you should have than that most of the European countries should have. The second thing we have to do is we have to be candid with Muslims. I mean, not every Muslim behaves badly, of course, we know that. We know it's maybe a minority, whatever. That's not the point. The point is to say, you've come to this country for all kinds of good reasons, but since you've come here, you have to accept the kind of standards in which we have evolved over the centuries and which we believe are fair and decent. Now, if you are a civic leader, a person of influence, holding down a respectable middle-class job, we expect you to tell your co-religionists that they can't behave in the way that they have done, that they are bringing shame to their community, and that you won't tolerate it. And we have a right to ask you that, because you came here. And we don't, at the moment, feel that about ourselves. We don't feel that confidence. I don't know, I'm not a social psychologist, I don't know how to do it. But I notice, for example, that young Indians, who I think very highly of when I meet them, young Indians have great self-confidence about being Indians and about their society. One reason may be that, like you, they have the Pledge of Allegiance at school every morning. They sing the national anthem. They're taught to believe that India is a great country, which indeed it is. the British have given up all that kind of thing, and maybe they have to be unsophisticated enough to discover those qualities and those practices again. Thank you.